excited to present to you guys today what we're building. Tyler, do you want to start off with a quick intro about yourself?
Yeah, sure thing. Really awesome to be here and really cool community that everyone's put together here. So I appreciate the chance to speak with everyone. My name is Tyler. My background's in biochemistry and molecular biology. Started out my sort of career thinking that I wanted to be a physician from the US originally. And sort of through that process of being a pre-med student and sort of volunteering at clinics and becoming, I think, more involved in sort of, understanding the process of medicine delivery and healthcare access, became a little bit frustrated with sort of how the United States functions in terms of things like access to care. I became increasingly involved in research. So I ended up pursuing initially, after I finished my studies, a fellowship in experimental therapeutics at Columbia University, where I was working mostly on translational drug development in the context of oncology. After that, became very interested in biogerontology and sort of the science of aging. I joined the National Institute on Aging and Johns Hopkins, where I worked for a period of time on DNA damage and repair. But during all of this time was really thinking about, what are sort of ways that we could potentially disrupt the let's say, funding dynamics that exist for science and for drug development, with a sort of focus on, like, let's say, some of the key problems and key barriers that prevent academics from being able to pursue the work that they're interested in, and for those drugs to ultimately be able to reach patients. After that, moved to South Africa, where I worked briefly in HIV vaccine development for a couple of years. Then about 3 years ago, co-founded Molecule with Paul Kohlhaas, who's my co-founder here. And our sort of core thesis at Molecule is really, what would the world look like if something like insulin was collectively owned by diabetics as opposed to pharmaceutical companies, for example? What would that do to access? What would it do to sort of incentives? And how could that change the sort of drug development ecosystem? And I'll pass it over to Paul.
Cool, thank you so much, Tyler. Maybe a little bit about myself. I started getting into biohacking and kind of online biohacking communities during high school. I was like 18, 19, and spent a lot of time on Reddit and kind of other forums where people were actively exploring really early forms of open source drug development for various indications where they simply couldn't get access to medication. So essentially exploring analogs to scheduled substances or to substances that were pretty, just that they were priced out of. And I found that really fascinating. A lot of these analogs were being produced in China, and people were simply looking for alternatives to things that they couldn't get access to. And then looked into biopharma more broadly and kind of began questioning, hey, why does it take so long to get certain medications to market? Looked at things like the opiate crisis in the early days in the United States. Just began questioning the status quo. And I think with biopharma is really one of these systems where we've come to accept that this is how it is, and that we feel that we can't change it. I then went on and studied, so I'm originally from Switzerland, studied economics at the University of St. Gallen, and during that time was trading biotech stocks. And we had a small kind of group of friends, students that were kind of looking at the market. And during that time also found out about Bitcoin. So this was in 2013. Then got into open source software development and found that really fascinating as an analogy to potentially how science could be done. If we think of how really open source software development fundamentally changed how we access free software today. And after that, actually began working in the cryptocurrency and blockchain ecosystem in mid 2015. Started a company, a software development company called Linen Labs that was dedicated to helping enterprises really understand how they could integrate early blockchain pilots. Really started actively building on Ethereum in early 2016. Did a project with UNICEF in digital identity, and through that started working with a company called Consensus, based out of New York and NSF. And during that time, spent a lot of my efforts working on data marketplaces and kind of designing incentives of how companies that were producing and siloing data sets could unlock those to researchers, specifically researchers that wanted to train AI models and use those data sets for machine learning. And got to this point where I had this aha moment that, wait, these data marketplaces could be reapplied to how data and IP is shared in biopharmaceutical development. And yeah, that led me to co-found Molecule together with Tyler in mid 2018. And since then, we've been on this path to try and enable open and collaborative drug development. And yeah, I want to use it as a segue to kind of give you guys a brief overview and presentation on how Molecule works as a system and what we're trying to build, and give a few examples of that. And then, yeah, thank you all so much, especially Michael and Brendan, for collecting the great questions. I actually we want to make the presentation relatively short, but rather really dedicate time to the amazing questions that you guys have and kind of enable a more open conversation. Tyler, could I actually, just because my internet is a little bit spotty, could I ask you to share the presentation?
Bear with me for 1 second. I have like 10,000 tabs open.
And then actually, let me try from my side.
Okay.
Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, all good
Yep,
here.
all good, all good.
Okay, wonderful. So at a high level, we believe that Molecule in its current inception is really the first marketplace, first global marketplace for biopharma IP. And our goal is to decentralize drug development and really help scientists get funding for the best early stage therapeutics. So kind of what I pointed out earlier, pharma today is facing a broad innovation crisis. So drug development today has never been more slow, expensive, or risky for participants. And this is an accelerating trend. So many of you know these statistics. It takes a really long time for drugs to reach market today. Development costs have spiraled. And because of this, many potential treatments never reach patients or are too expensive. It's actually projected that in 2020, it's already last year, the IRR from R&D within pharma companies is predicted to 0%. So many pharma companies today might be better off actually not even investing in R&D in the first place from an economic perspective. So you'll kind of see that I tend to look at this also with an economic lens. And in fact, today, most early stage therapeutics are developed in academia and biotech startups, not in large pharmaceutical companies. And at the same time, these larger pharma companies are really trying to find early stage innovation. And there's something called the Valley of Death in drug development, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that many promising discoveries in the discovery and kind of target validation lead optimization phase never actually make it across that phase into the clinic. And the reason for that is because there's a big lack in funding specifically in that stage. And I think that's also something that the BioDojo community really helps to teach its members and its community. Essentially, how can we work better as a community to ensure that the research projects that you guys are working on actually receive funding and can advance to patients. So at its core, we believe that pharma and the biotech industry today really lacks an efficient marketplace. So on the supply side, there's a big lack of visibility on projects. As a researcher today, how do I actually make sure that my projects get seen by the right people? And this would specifically actually be patients. How can I ensure that patients would actually have an influence on defining what treatments they would like to receive? There's a big lack of access to financing. There's a lack of collaboration and partners. Many universities and tech transfer offices specifically are very poorly equipped to actually help researchers define commercial efforts, let's say outside of the big biotech hubs such as Oxford, Stanford, MIT. And then we found in our research that tech transfer strategies today are quite ineffective. On the demand side, you also have a host of problems. So how is deal sourcing done? How do we execute on deals? How do we due diligence research projects? It's very geographically restricted. So there's amazing drug development teams in universities that simply don't have access to, let's say, a broader funding ecosystem, that have access to VCs. Another big problem is data access. So actually, when I find an interesting research project, it can take a really long time until a university or even a biotech company is willing to share the underlying data. And then lastly, IP is a really illiquid asset class today. It's very hard to price IP efficiently. And then once you kind of begin transacting in it, it's actually a very illiquid asset class. And really our goal is to solve this problem by matching scientists, investors, and pharma companies, as well as patients on a platform that facilitates discovery, financing, and collaboration. This is kind of what our current system looks like. We've named this molecule discovery. So in molecule discovery, a researcher or research team at university can essentially create a project page that features the project. So we look at what type of opportunity is this. You'd have a project summary, a project timeline, the amount of funding that you're looking to raise. And you can compare this to like a ResearchGate profile, but coupled very strongly with the commercial underpinnings of what this opportunity entails. So ResearchGate projects are typically only for non-commercial opportunities. And so we've tried to develop a framework that will help researchers and labs kind of really put their research into a framework that would enable a patient or a VC or any type of funder really to adequately assess that. So really enable a much more streamlined due diligence process. And what we then do is so Molecule's developed quite a sophisticated tech stack that relies on decentralized finance and the fractionalization of IP. So really what we're building with Molecule is a two-sided marketplace. So if we go one slide back, so this is kind of the funder view. I can search by different therapeutic areas. I can search by the clinical stage of something, or by the opportunity type. So someone looking for funding, someone looking for collaborators. And then what we do is we essentially, through the use of blockchain technology, we fractionalize ownership in the IP. And we make the IP itself virtual and digital by attaching it to a framework that is called a non-fungible token. And what this looks like on our side, so you have researchers, again, globally, this could be, let's say, a researcher in Peru that uploads IP and data into Molecule Discovery. So you begin hosting a project. And then if there's sufficient interest on it, we turn that project into something that we call an IP NFT. So you may have heard of NFTs in the music industry or specifically in the art industry. And that is also a form of IP in the broader sense. So where artists have begun trading copyrights of their artwork. And in our sense, we've developed a more sophisticated framework to be able to attach a biotech IP through sub-licenses or even patents in some cases to NFTs. And then the next thing that we do is it travels through a layer on a platform called Molecule Finance, where we essentially begin fractionalizing that IP. And then it moves into something we call IP or biopharma DAOs. We're actually right in this very moment in the launch process of a first biopharma DAO called BioDojo, which is dedicated to funding longevity research across the globe. And then on the other side, funders can now participate in these biopharma DAOs and biopharma collectives, and in return, potentially receive governance rights over the underlying IP. Super happy, so this may have been a lot of information. Super happy to explore that in more depth and kind of answer any questions after the presentation. This kind of recaps our tech stack again at a higher level. So again, we make IP natively digital, first by attaching ownership to non-fungible tokens. We then have various frameworks that essentially allow to tokenize that IP and distribute it to multiple stakeholders. So you can have an IP asset, and now you could have some of the ownership be retained by the university, some of the ownership go to a patient or multiple patient advocacy groups that are now funding the development of this particular research project. You could allocate some of it to a contract research organization that now also receives ownership in the asset for the work that they're putting in, for the data that they're putting in. So essentially, Molecule really enables this fluid transfer of funds and research data in return for ownership in the underlying IP. We then create liquid markets for this IP, so to actually make it tradable at later stages. And then as a last stage, once you make something owned by multiple people, you then have to think, how do we govern this asset? And that's where these decentralized autonomous organizations or DAOs get really interesting. Again, I may be throwing a lot of terminology at you guys here, If you're interested to kind of learn more about this deeply, we have a really good blog post that explains some of these principles, and would also love to invite many of you to kind of join our Discord community, where we can run through this in more depth. Yes, I just mentioned VitaDAO earlier. So VitaDAO is a global collective that is formed over the past month, really dedicated to funding research into human longevity. And so Molecule has helped VitaDAO already kind of procure one of its first projects and first assets with the University of Copenhagen. So we have a first fully fledged POC, which is a preclinical drug repurposing project that will explore 10 molecules that could potentially extend human lifespan. And that project is essentially about to get funded. VitaDAO actually today, we're in, I think, the last 45 minutes of the auction closing. We've already raised over $3 million within this entity, which is super exciting. So it's actually quite a monumental day. You guys picked a very interesting just time slot for this for this call. So a quick recap: VitaDAO is a decentralized collective funding early stage longevity research, and VitaDAO's mission is to extend human lifespan by essentially financing all sorts of research projects in this area. And VitaDAO and its members own the intellectual property assets that result from the project it supports. And members can really freely join VitaDAO by earning Vita tokens through contributions of work, through contributing intellectual property into the collective, or by contributing funds. So we are also in parallel in talks already with multiple startups that want to contribute their IP into this collective, with multiple other universities. So it's taken on a really interesting dynamic, and we actually believe these open systems can have major advantages for the researchers that we're working with. So for example, in VitaDAO and with the University of Copenhagen, their entire research lab is integrated into the Discord and kind of actively posting updates from the lab, really actively engaging with this community of patients and enthusiasts that has kind of come to life about this. This is kind of a high level kind of graph of how this mini economy works around VitaDAO. So you have different members. You have members of the public that can become members of VitaDAO by contributing funds. And in return, they receive Vita governance tokens. And these governance tokens enable them to vote on how the organization functions, on what type of funding it should support, and so on. VitaDAO in turn holds IP NFTs and essentially furthers the development of those of that research. And in return, it can contract labs and distribute funding to labs across the world and also own these data assets. I think I mentioned most of this. So VitaDAO will provide funding initially in the range of 50K to up to 1 million. The focus of VitaDAO is really on early stage, high risk, high reward longevity projects. And our aim is to really make very rapid funding decisions that would essentially outcompete how grant organizations typically provide funding, or even how VCs can typically provide funding. So really aim to do something that is much faster than the status quo in the industry today. And we currently have about 1,000, already actually far over 1,000 people in our Discord, and have really managed to build a large community of academics and researchers via this global incentive and governance scheme that VitaDAO provides. If you come into our Discord, you'll see researchers from different labs, universities introduce themselves every day. We actually had a student from Canada come and join the Discord today, introduce themselves. Cool. At this point, I've done a lot of talking, and I want to hand it over to Tyler to potentially just jump into the first questions.
So I would like to join for a minute. I am also helping Molecule for the projects and the researchers, and now I will post a link in the chat. There you can fill maybe a survey, and probably there you will see some questions up until the end of the conversation we are having. You can fill it in. We would love to have you on our platform. This would be the way I can reach you back. So I'd be happy if you fill the survey in.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. And let me first start by saying, well, congratulations on launching this today. I can imagine it's a very chaotic, but also very happy kind of day for you guys. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us about this. While you're also launching this massive proof of concept, this is very exciting.
Yeah, it's been a super chaotic time for our team, but we were really excited to connect with you guys. And actually, yeah, the auction is still running at the moment. Yeah, so it's quite exciting. It's really, I think, a massive milestone to
Nice.
think that we can actually effectively and we can actually successfully launch these new type of global collective structures. And you could imagine a collective like BioDojo to form around insulin research, for example, or specific cancer therapeutics, where actually now the core stakeholder group is comprised of patients that provide this early funding.
Yeah, democratization of research funding is kind of one of the really exciting topics that at least us here in BioDojo are really excited about, both being young and kind of seeing problems with the existing system, and also being young and open to new solutions, especially with technologies that we've become familiar with, like crypto. So without further ado, we'll get some guided Q&A, and if there is time prior to 11:50 p.m. EST, then we'll open the floor to audience questions. If you guys felt like the presentation was too fast, you can always go back and rewatch the recording that we will post on our YouTube channel, which we will email. We'll post a link out on our Twitter, hopefully. So I think we can just jump right into the questions if you guys are good.
Yeah, perfect.
Cool. So the purpose of these questions are more like it's more so to break down the presentation bit by bit and kind of get a story of how molecular TO goes from the problem it sees at solving to the means of it doing that. So I guess the first question that probably comes to a lot of people's minds, especially if they're not familiar with how research funding works, is what about the status quo of lab funding was problematic in your guys' opinion?
Yeah, so if you speak to a tenured academic or somebody who's been working in a research laboratory for quite a long time, I think you'll find that if they're running a laboratory, they're probably spending more time actually actively trying to fundraise than they are carrying out research. And this is a frustration for a lot of people. In terms of the actual dynamics of how research is funded, and more specifically how drug development is funded, a lot of things have really evolved over the past, let's say, 20 years. Paul touched on this in his presentation, but market dynamics in pharma have really changed to the point where instead of pharma operating on this sort of vertically integrated end-to-end pipeline where they do in-house R&D and bring drugs to market, they outsource most of their innovation from academia. Now, academia itself relies on public funding sources, things like grants, for example, that are often quite laborious to apply for and tend to support basic research. So really the fundamental pursuit of knowledge, things that are not necessarily aimed at producing a commercial product. And then startups and let's say sort of later stage VC funding tend to support assets and therapeutics that are sort of de-risked and at a certain stage. So this goes back to that sort of translational valley of death that Paul was talking about previously, where for those who have actually made a discovery in the laboratory, maybe are at the stage where they've identified a compound and are optimizing that, they now need to figure out a way to actually get this to the clinic, bring in quite a bit of funding, and actually, the main way that people rely on that currently is by outsourcing that out-licensing that to a pharmaceutical company, which from a preferential perspective isn't always really preferred. A lot of researchers would like to have autonomy with their inventions and their discoveries. They would like to be able to be a part of the development of these things. So, one of the things that we're hoping to disrupt or hoping to improve is almost creating like this, creator economy for researchers. This idea that somebody who made a discovery could tap into a community. Let's say I discover a drug for Huntington's disease, but I don't have the capital or the resources that it takes to bring this to market, and I don't necessarily just want it to be sold off to a pharma. I'm not really left with many options other than going out and trying to create a startup, and maybe I'm too early anyway. So what we want to do is we want to enable people to tap into communities, maybe communities of Huntington's disease patients, to be able to fund the experiments that are needed to sort of get this asset to a point where it is really de-risked to the point for other follow-on investors to come in or other co-development partners to come in and sort of provide the support it needs. There's a lot of things that we could say broadly about funding in general in the sciences and a lot of frustrations, but the core areas that we're really focusing on in this case are drug development and actually trying to move something from academia into the clinic.
Interesting. So it's kind of like this loss of leverage that happens on the researchers' ends when they effectively outsource scaling of their ideas to big pharma. And that's kind of like one of the key problems that you guys saw.
Yeah, I mean, and this is not necessarily by choice, right? It's almost by necessity. There's sort of this, you go from, in basic research, maybe it doesn't require a huge amount of funding to get an idea, to form a hypothesis and maybe begin doing some early exploration into like drug discovery. The preclinical stage is also not brutally expensive, but it's really when you get into the clinical trial phases that these are really, really significant investments, and people don't necessarily want to take those risks or invest into assets like that unless they're sufficiently de-risked. So there's a need for the sort of capital allocation that universities, for example, often can't really provide from a drug development standpoint.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for kind of for clarifying that. So now we can kind of dive into more like the incentives of things, because with every network, there needs to be incentives that make people run the system and participate in it. So Molecules Pipeline connects funders and labs, and you mentioned things like NFTs. You mentioned or data assets. What do these mean in terms of tangible things that they get? Are these like actual like figures that they would get that they exclusively own? Like, how would that look like in like a situation, in like an actual like research project situation?
Yeah, so in the case of the research project, so typically at the stage we're at the moment, we try to focus on pre-IP assets or things that have already been patented. So there has to be a tangible commercial project, which could be a range of molecules that are being investigated, or a particular molecule that can be out licensed either from an entity or from a university or tech transfer office. So we're currently not focusing on, let's say, basic research, where commercialization aspects are still quite out, like far out. What we have found a very interesting stage to be is the stage where something is not patented yet by the university and really sitting in the TTO, but at a stage where we could verifiably say that this is this is a very interesting research project that has a commercial opportunity. We then work with a set of advisors, many of which have spent years in the biotech VC space, that have a lot of biotech startup experience, and try to help out-license that asset or that research project from the university. And then what we do is we work through a variety of licensing frameworks that are typically stock standard in the industry. And we try to, essentially what we're trying to do at Molecule is we automate those licensing frameworks. So a university or a lab or a research group could say, cool, we're willing to out-license this on the following terms because we're seeking funding for this. And in essence, what we do through fractionalizing the asset is we distribute ownership in the asset in the same way that you would distribute ownership in a company potentially. So often when a startup leaves a university or is out spun out, some universities might say, cool, but we want to keep 20-30% of the future royalty rights, or we want to actually own equity in that startup. And there's a whole range of ways to structure that. And so as Molecule, we help structure that. What we don't do, or what we can't really do at the moment, because that's a much harder like research kind of field to fund, is to focus on basic research, on proving kind of high level hypotheses, and that sort of thing. Tyler?
Maybe just one additional point to focus on. So I think from like a ethos and a vision and a mission perspective, what we would really hope to see one day would be something like a fully open source drug development system where, you had laboratories all over the world contributing research to GitHub repositories, and there was an incentive from the perspective of this being a public good or something that was valuable to do for humanity in a nonprofit driven way for people to actually work to bring these things to market. And there's been a few groups like Open Source Pharma or OSP that have really done a lot of pioneering in that space. They do this around tuberculosis, they do it around mycetoma, they do it around malaria. They have a bunch of researchers committing data to a GitHub repository, but where they've really struggled is when it actually comes to the point of producing these drugs or trying to bring these therapeutics to market, because you don't have the market exclusivity that is sort of guaranteed by a patent. There's no one really willing to take the risk and commercialize. And I think the early conceptualization of Molecule was We have the current system, which is very monopolistic and very sort of siloed, very controlling. And we have this open source vision that we would one day like to achieve. And by fractionalizing ownership in a therapeutic very broadly, so maybe to hundreds of people that are essentially become governors of that IP or have some say in how that IP is commercialized, you're still maintaining the integrity of the patent, you're still maintaining intellectual property protections. But now, instead of having one pharmaceutical company own it, the incentives fundamentally change because it's owned by a community of people who are impacted by, that therapeutic specifically. And the idea is that that provides some leverage when it comes to things like pricing and access. If I'm a patient myself and I have a say in how a drug is priced, I'm probably going to optimize for something very different than a pharmaceutical company that is maybe publicly owned or has a board of shareholders to satisfy. So I think the goal is to move towards something open source, moves towards something that's really patient focused, but being fully cognizant that all of the work we do still needs to be sort of functional in the context of the current system.
So I guess long term, the goal is to move your target demographic of funders from, let's say, people with like the traditional investors or people who are in the crypto space, moving from them to the real the epitome of the stakeholder in pharmaceuticals, which is the patients of the diseases being treated.
Exactly.
Nice, amazing.
Hmm.
That actually answers. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and maybe to add something just on the data side. So it's really interesting what Tyler said around contributing data sets into like these GitHub repositories. So essentially, something to imagine is that a lot of the assets that will live on Molecule essentially live off the underlying data. So biopharma is really two core things. It's IP and data. And if we can distribute data production, for example, so with Molecule, you could imagine you could create these pools. I could create a bounty and I could say, if someone can provide me the toxicology reports on this, I'm willing to pay them a mix of 2% of ownership, tokenized ownership in the asset, and 10K in cash. Just a very broad example. And now any laboratory or university or researcher could come and say, hey, I can do these toxicology reports and kind of get approved by the owner of the asset and then kind of deliver that data. So that's another way that like once this ecosystem gets into running, that you can essentially actively exchange ownership for data as well as data for funds that are already within a project. And for us, this is really kind of the dawn of like BioFi. We know that there's like fintech or like DeFi, decentralized finance. And for us, this is like biological finance, like combining and making the financing and funding processes and data exchange processes much more efficient. Obviously, this is quite a long-term and very ambitious goal, but it's something that we think is much needed and could really radically change how drugs are brought to patients and really increase the diversity of potential therapies that are available.
I like the term BioFi. It's you're the first person to have coined it. I could be wrong, but I think I've never heard it before. I like that. So actually, you guys answered quite a few of the questions that I had on my end. I guess the final one, just to kind of clarify and make it really kind of draw clear the line in the sand. So you guys are targeting right now the demographic for labs is labs that are kind of at this pre-commercialization stage, as opposed to like the basic science labs. So in regards to patents, let's say when if an idea goes to patent, or like I guess like what is the big payoff at the end of the day for your stakeholders?
I mean, it really depends what stakeholder group you focus on. I think it's kind of like asking, so with marketplaces, you tend to have multiple stakeholder groups. And so our primary stakeholder groups are really scientists. So I think for them, the big payoff is getting a much easier access to funding, being able to directly connect with patients and accelerating their research. So something, for example, for the lab that we work with at the University of Copenhagen, which is their aging research lab, I think it's been a really fulfilling experience to be able to connect directly with a community of patients and enthusiasts that are really passionate about their research, and to be able to do your research more publicly without necessarily kind of like jeopardizing the validity of the IP. And I think that's, as a researcher, I think that can be an extremely fulfilling experience, kind of moving your research and biopharma research out of this like air of secrecy and being like, hey, there's so many people that care about what it's doing, and like and not just kind of talking to like the next level stakeholders today, which would in many cases are unfortunately pharma companies or VCs that typically I think can give a quite like disheartening experience to a researcher, simply because they either care about money or they care about like getting the IP from you as best as they can to then make as much money from it as they can. And I think that can be, yeah, that can be disheartening. On the other side, obviously, you have grant organizations which have really noble goals, but are just inundated with funding requests typically. So one of the researchers that we spoke to, like anecdotally said, he spends 80% of his time writing grant applications and 20% of his time in the lab. And so if we can shift that to like 20% like funding applications and 80% in the lab, I think that would, yeah, that would be awesome. And maybe then it's like, instead of writing applications, it's actually consists of spend much more of your time engaging with patients and the people's lives that you want to change. Yeah, as opposed to the people that have commercial interests because they have shareholders and they have people that they're beholden to.
I would like to share a mini something with you, a mini sheet. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, again.
So actually we touched to many points, but I would like to also say, as individuals, as smaller labs, you have a great advantage here being with us, because we have a great community to give you feedback on your content. Or for the University of Copenhagen example, we had the same situation, that they had the chance to talk with the people directly in our channels. And also many of the laborious work Paul mentioned, we can help you with this process. Actually, we are trying to limit to the least, so you can get through these things easier, because normally the way for you would be going through the university office or the DTOs, which can be quite a bit of a work. And also I put some examples down below there about the actual money people received over the years, and you can see some examples from our project from the Denmark, University of Copenhagen. So yeah, I just wanted to share this sheet with you. And if you go to the websites I shared in the chat, especially BioDojo, you can find a bit more information on the working groups or how things are structured a bit better.
Thank you. We'll also be providing links to what you guys are building out here, because we have to. I mean, it's our obligation to share this, because this is we also love this the vision that you guys are painting here. So thank you. So that concludes the guided Q&A of things. Now we have some audience questions that are coming in. So this is an open mic. This will be an open mic kind of audience Q&A session. I will ask the first audience question because the person does not have a functioning mic. So I'll ask on their behalf, and then people can jump in from there. So the first question that came in on my side, which is, what qualifies as an NFT in this case? If I understand rightly, NFTs can be traded. In this sense, how can a lab prevent its discovery from being traded to other labs?
Cool question. So essentially, as a lab, if you were to attach your IP to an NFT, or like, let's say you were to attach a research project to an NFT, you could just do that without actually selling it. So you could just say, cool, you know what, let's put this up here, and maybe we let people bid on it without actually having to sell it. So you could put it out there and then have different people come along and bid on your IP with predefined terms. You could also kind of allow people to define the terms that they would be willing to bid on it for. So if your lab had, say, 5 research projects and they have their off-commercial interest, and you map the IP to an NFT in a good way, you could just upload them and see who's actually interested in this stuff. And through that, you could connect with groups that you would have otherwise never been able to connect to. And you could transact in your IP within seconds, in essence. It's a different technologically, it's a different question whether that's efficient. Now to the question specifically, what would prevent that? So the same mechanisms that prevent, let's say, someone from contravening a traditional licensing agreement. So we do protect the IP following kind of industry standards. So there's nothing like weird where like you would say, let's attach my research to this, and then I upload it and then it's suddenly gone.
Maybe an important point,
yeah.
just for clarification on that. I mean, the thing that is actually being attached to an NFT in these cases is either something that it's typically a legal document or a legal contract in essence. It could be a license, it could be a patent, but the fact that you're attaching it to an NFT does not change the nature of those legal agreements in any way. They still are bound in the same fashion as they would be in a non-digital sort of realm.
Actually, something that's really cool that we're very actively that we're actively working on is essentially enabling federated data storage and zero knowledge computation. So you could store the data that essentially represents your research project on site, so it gets stored in your lab. But the NFT essentially provides a way for any outside party to kind of come in and unlock that data. So the NFT is almost like a private key that can be used by someone who purchases it to unlock the data and gain access to it. You can now enable cool things with this called using zero knowledge compute, where I could run computation on this federated data storage that you're providing without revealing the data or the identity of the molecule. So I could come in and I could run computation on it that says, can molecule X that you say you have cure, potentially, do you have data that it could cure indication Y? And I could run that computation without revealing any part of the data. And this could be really interesting because it could make, it could really push patenting down the line, because you could provide proofs around your research without having to reveal it. That's a gross oversimplification of how this might work in industry, but just to kind of give you an idea.
So wait, so you guys are implementing zero knowledge proofs into the system? Yeah. Nice. That'll also make the computation. It'll make the system more computationally efficient. I can imagine as well, because you have this validation, but you also have to go through less computing steps to actually get that validation, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay, so we have a second question coming in here. So Ahmed, you want to go in?
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of the way you would, I guess, let's say you're trying to fund a project using one of the tokens, would it be specifically focused on an organization? So I know you talked about the University of Copenhagen, or is it a specific lab, or is it a specific project? So is it possible for like one lab to have multiple tokens based on a series of projects they're running? How, like, I guess, granular can you get?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, in terms of the granularity, you would always do this on a per asset or a per project basis. So you wouldn't, for example, while you could create like an index, or, if you had an agreement with the university where you said, hey, just as purely from a logistical perspective now, we're going to take your entire TTO portfolio and tokenize it and almost have it be represented as like an ETF sort of structure that represented the university's portfolio. You could do that, but that's certainly not what we're doing at the moment. It tends to be much more granular, focused typically on the researcher and an individual project. Where that is flipped a little bit is with the DAO structures. So something like BioDojo, for example, BioDojo as a structure and as an organization is a DAO that aims to hold many different NFTs or many different pieces of IP from the longevity space. And if people want broader exposure to let's say a portfolio of these assets, they can gain that indirectly through something like BioDojo. But the tokenization itself happens on a fairly individual basis.
Okay, and kind of the reason I ask this is, I guess maybe more in the future, in the long term, would it be possible for kind of your model to be used to fund independent scientific institutions that are separate from academia, where now I don't have to go get a PhD to do my research, but now there's an institution funded by this decentralized token or group that runs the research? Let's say it's longevity research. Is that like a possibility?
I think that's part of the dream, right? I mean, I don't know if it would mean foregoing credentials, because I think training is an extremely important part of the actual process. But I mean, in terms of being free of, if you look at what the DeFi space did for decentralized finance, sort of managing to do everything that it achieved without the banks and without the normal sort of regulatory hurdles. I mean, those are the sort of dreams that I would have in the context of one day in drug development and research, enabling communities to actually support individuals to create their own organizations for research that are not restricted or confined by, let's say, the constraints of a university. And I would hope that universities also become much more progressive here as well. That's one of the things we hope to see change. But I think this is very, very long view sort of thinking, right? This is the sort of thing that I think we can hope for on the scale of decades, maybe, as opposed to something that we would see happen over the next few years. But yeah, great question.
Awesome. So the time is now, so we have about 2 minutes before you guys have to go. I think if you guys are down, we can squeeze in one more question. So VitaDAO provides, this is a question I've gotten from the chat. VitaDAO provides the incentive of voting in return for funds. Is the voting weightage proportional to the investment?
In its current iteration, it is, yeah. So basically, there's different mechanisms that we're exploring in the context of a V2. Things like delegating your votes, allowing other people, so almost like a representative democracy, where people could defer their votes to, let's say, a domain-specific expert or a PhD that they felt like maybe was better suited to evaluate things on their behalf. But at the moment, in this sort of, let's say, V1 vanilla implementation, it is weighted based on the investment. So there is certainly an advantage that can be gained by, contributing much more to the vehicle than another person.
I guess long term, though, that you guys in turn change that, judging by how you're.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's what we would want to, I think there will always need to be some incentive for someone to give to an organization at a level greater than someone else, right? And the question for me that, like, you want to motivate people to contribute, a lot, to have an incentive that is proportionate to that contribution. I think the key is to ensuring that the power doesn't become too centralized in any one person's hands, and that people have the ability to delegate votes and basically allow a community member that they trust to be bestowed with that power from multiple individuals. So you could have 10 people, for example, who maybe have 1/10 of the share in this organization as somebody who has 100 tokens. But those 10 people could say, we want to delegate our decision-making power to this representative and have them act on our behalf because we trust their decision-making. And these are the sort of things that I think you can begin to create or play with to help, still have this sort of autonomy and still allow, democratic governance, but also have more efficient decision making. And we're looking at things like, there's also things like quadratic voting, where you might have, let's say, 100 votes is only, half that of 100 tokens would only have half the voting power of 1,000 tokens instead of a 10th or something like this. But we're still sort of modeling this and playing with the implementation to understand how this would actually affect dynamics and incentives.
To clarify, quadratic voting is basically more voting power to the equivalent amount of tokens if more people own those tokens. So like if you have X tokens owned over Y people, and you have X tokens owned by Z people, if the X tokens owned by Y people, if Y people is like 100 and Z tokens is like owned by like 10 people, then the X tokens owned by Y people will have more voting power. Kind of more like, because it has like a tragedy of the commons aspect to it.
Yes,
to clarify,
exactly.
Quadratic funding, that's a pretty, it's a big term. But yes, okay, so that wraps it up. I know you guys are on a tight schedule. Is there any final words that you guys want to leave with the audience and whoever's watching this on YouTube?
Thank you so much for the invite. Like, would love to maybe continue the conversation at some stage if any of you are interested. I posted the link to our Discord. Please feel free to join that. Just trickle in, ask us more challenging questions. We really enjoy it. Kind of, the rigor and the depth, the intellectual depth that you guys did at like looking at what we're building, which is really exciting. And I mean, fun, if any of you guys have research projects in different areas that you're working on individually or with your university, with your lab, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to get in touch, look at what you're working on and really support you. We're also actively hiring in a variety of ranges. So please feel free to reach out and get in touch. And thank you so much.
I'd hope to engage with the community more in the future. This is like an absolutely crazy, very distracting day for us because we're going to log off here and then go get sucked into a huge number of things that need to happen in the next 2 hours. But if you guys ever want to chat again or want to come to our Discord and have, I'm sure there's a million additional questions that you could ask, and we would love to spend some time engaging. So looking forward to more engagement in the future. And thanks for your time.
If everybody watching on YouTube, all the links to Molecule and the community and the Discord will be in the description below. Thanks, guys, for coming, and good luck. Bye.
Bye, guys.